the story is not just a story, it's a story of value. It's a new superstructure, right? Because when there's a crisis of coherence, coherence is coherent intimacy. Intimacy comes from a shared story of value. But if there's a crisis of coherence, if there's a meta crisis, it means that I've got to tell a new story of value, which by its very nature is a story of Eros value, and Eros value generates new coherence. But for Yuval, for Skinner, for Orwell, there is no Eros value. It doesn't exist. So the story is not a story of value, and it can't actually generate new coherence because we're attracted and allured to create a new coherence through the story of value. No, story is a cynical, manipulative structure, right, of a dominating infrastructure, social structure that imposes a fictional story in order to create coherence, taking advantage of this weird fluke of evolution that people weirdly cohere around fictional stories. It's a big week, and it's been a big 2 weeks up till now. And we have a lot we want to do today. Thank you, Christina Amlon, for your beautiful Dharma recapitulation. Thank you, Krista, for your beautiful opening of space. And I would just invite everyone, there's a beautiful opening of the space every week at about 10:02. It was really beautiful today. And it's just this deep way of kind of just entering and accessing our ability to do sense making, which requires us to go deep into the silence, because any language that's worth listening to emerges from the silence. There's always two kinds of words. And this is not something that we want to, this is not a side footnote. This is more important than anything else we'll say today. And there's two kinds of words. There's words that come from the silence and words that don't come from the silence. Words that kind of cover up the silence. But even words that come from the silence need to be open to the depth of the field of value that lives in the silence. Right? The silence is not the place of intelligence. It's the place of consciousness. And what we're here to do in these 9 or 10 weeks together is not to engage Yuval Harari's thought, right? So I want to just kind of make a slight edit, to Haley when we publish those Dharma recaps, right? It's not so much about, we're not interested in responding to Yuval, right? That's, I kind of talked about that the first week. We're not interested in responding to Yuval Harari. Yuval Harari is I'm sure a very nice man. As I've said from the beginning, I'm gonna assume that he's operating in good faith, right? There's a bad faith argument about Yuval out there, which has quite a lot of support for it. I'm not going to adopt that. I assume that Yuval's a beautiful man operating in good faith, and I made that clear the first week. He's not a philosopher, and doesn't set himself up as one. He's not a kind of thinker. He's not, a teacher kind of emerging from a lineage or creating a new lineage, right? He's essentially a populist historian who took his world history course that he gave at Hebrew U, which was the kind of course that young professors, are forced to give. And he turned it into a great course. He did a great job. And it's a kind of popular kind of attempt to kind of look at world history. And nicely done. It's important. And the reason it's appealing to people is because he's paradoxically attempting to actually tell a story that in some sense makes links to different parts of reality. So instead of getting lost in what has often been called deformation professionnelle, right? In other words, professional deformation, where there's this kind of narrow casting, right, in the academy, in which you have one discipline you're in, and you interpret all of reality through that discipline, but that discipline actually doesn't exhaust reality. right? So if you're a chemist, all of reality is chemistry. If you're a physicist, all of reality is physics. If you're a mathematician, all of reality is math. But if you're a sociologist, then all of reality is sociology. And if you're a intellectual historian, it's about intellectual history. And if you're a social historian, it's not about intellectual history, it's about social history. And actually, that's absurd because all of these are true. Each of them is looking at a different dimension of the elephant and saying it's the whole elephant. And in that, Yuval and I share, right, the sense that we need a kind of a whole. We need things to relate to each other in a fundamental way. There's a broader sense, right? In order to make any sense of anything, we need to see how are these things connected, and we need to approach, right, in some sense from all disciplines together. Paradoxically, so I'd say the best way to say it is that Yuval is not an intellectual historian, and although in his particular area, I think he is, right, which is the history of war, but Yuval is a very, very good storyteller. And that's actually what we're going to talk about today, because part of Yuval's story is that no stories are real, or that virtually no stories are real. But let me go slow for a second. Let me go 2 steps back. And we're not interested in having a conversation with Yuval per se, although mad love, and I look forward, Yuval, right, to actually talking whenever we do, my friend. But Yuval is what we called an uncontaminated representative, right, and that's a scholarly term, an uncontaminated representative of the postmodern zeitgeist, right, of what late modernity and postmodernity is saying. And, his kind of list of endorsements from legacy institutions and legacy figures who I've mentioned every week, I won't repeat them, right, all over the world, is actually a little shocking. Because here you have this person, and let me, that's 1. 2, that's 1, 2, 3. Yuval is unique, though. Where he's unique is that he doesn't pull the punch. He kind of says it clearly. He doesn't, there's an entire school of thinkers who kind of pull the punch, or they try and kind of obfuscate. They try and Yuval doesn't pull the punch. Steven Pinker at Harvard pulls the punch generally. Shoshana Zuboff wrote Surveillance Capitalism, right, pulls the punch. Nicholas Carr, who critiques very severely, right, and appropriately the textplex in a book that he first wrote in 2011 called The Shallows, and in 4 books afterwards, right, my favorite one is a book he wrote in 2015, which is a series of essays called Utopia is Creepy, another book called The Glass House. But Nicholas pulls the punch. He's a postmodernist. He doesn't think that meaning or value is actually real, but he doesn't want to actually acknowledge that, so he pulls the punch, right? So there's an enormous amount of kind of cryptonormativity. And by cryptonormativity, the cryptonormative position is we pretend like value is real, right? We take out a loan from early modernity, right, or pre-modernity. We kind of assume value is real, but then we tell you that it's not, right, for an entire series of reasons. But then we assume that it is anyways. And it's this strange position that kind of worked in modernity. You could get away in modernity with kind of expressing the notion that value is not real, like David Hume did, for example, and then claiming value on the other side, right? And I called those in other writings the common sense sacred axioms of value that live in modernity, right? You could kind of say, okay, value is not real. Let me explain all the reasons why it's not, but then I'm going to claim it anyways. And Thomas Jefferson did that in the American Constitution. Thomas Jefferson was deeply influenced by Epicurus. And Epicurus, the ancient Greek pre-Socratic, lives in an age when it's just a given that value is real. It's a given that the gods are real, even if you don't believe in the gods, right? And so Epicurus, if you actually follow his logic to its conclusion, Epicurus is actually a materialist atheist. But you can't be a materialist atheist at the time, several hundred years before the Common Era. And so he pulls the punch, and Epicurus himself probably wasn't fully aware of the extent he was pulling the punch. Jefferson reads Epicurus. Jefferson's a deist, and a deist is a way of saying, well, kind of everything's God, but nothing's God, right? And it's you kind of talk about God all the time. God kind of wound up the watch, but not really present at the banquet anymore. Jefferson's one of the framers of the Constitution. a group of framers. And in this group of framers, they say we hold these truths, these are truths of value, to be self-evident. Now, when you claim truths to be self-evident, you mean a couple of things. They're so blatantly obvious. Well, if they're so blatantly obvious, and this is your founding document, why don't you tell us where they're from? But you're actually not sure where they're from. You're not sure how to articulate them. You're involved in this kind of contradiction. You've kind of deconstructed value, yet you want to claim it. So you make this move, which is we hold these truths to be self-evident, which I think is one very good reading of the American Constitution. It's not the only one, but it's one good reading. So these common sense sacred axioms of value, you can deconstruct value and assume it, lives deeply in modernity already, but it actually explodes in postmodernity. And in postmodernity, the mask is ripped off. In postmodernity, the veneer of value is ripped off. In postmodernity, when you read Derrida, for example, right, there's this reduction of reality to story, but the word just always modifies story. It's just a story. And most of the stories that define reality are fictional stories. They're not stories that express true value, because true value doesn't exist. It's not actually real, right? That loan, the social capital of value that we borrowed from pre-modernity and modernity, and we held the loan quietly in modernity, postmodernity calls in that loan and explodes, right, the kind of hidden funding, right, the hidden kind of funding of culture that's taking place through this loan, and says, actually, value is not real. Value is not real, and value and meaning are used interchangeably all the time, right? There is no ultimate inherent intrinsic value / meaning in reality. And Harari, in dozens of passages that we've already adduced, right, makes this point, right? He says, if you think that there's any meaning, it is a delusion. If you think there's a plot line to reality, it is a delusion. If you think that you have some role to play, it is a delusion. Right? Delusion is his word. Right? If you think that any value is better than any other value, not true. Not true, because it's not real. It's completely contrived. So any thought you have like that is a figment of your imagination, and not in a good way. It is a fiction, his quote, or a mere social construct. So let's not be afraid to call it for what it is. And I appreciate Yuval because he's honest. He doesn't pull the punch. That's what's unique about him. He's an uncontaminated expression of this postmodern moment, and he doesn't pull the punch. He draws the conclusion. Okay. So all of this was just by way of saying hello. We haven't said anything yet. We're just kind of saying hello. But now I want to dive in. Okay. Who's up for a dive? We're going to do a big dive now. And I want to kind of take it slow. And let's go all the way. Okay. And again, we're not interested in Yuval, right? Yuval is going to be our kind of interlocutor. He's going to be our foil to try and establish, right, this new story of value, and to try and understand, what do we need to establish in this new story of value to actually be able to enact a story of value in which we can be filled with joy, in which we can be filled with delight, in which we can respond to the meta crisis, in which we can live our lives, right, and live a life well lived, in which we can speak to our children and tell our children, this is what's true, and this is how we want to guide you and invite you into your life. Right? And what we tell a child, when we look at a child in the eye, what we're able to tell a child kind of honestly and truly and deeply is what we know to be true. Now, I want to kind of go like 10 levels deeper here. And for those of you who are new to One Mountain, so first off, like, welcome, crazy welcome, everyone. Like, welcome. Okay, welcome. Thank you for being here. Welcome. So, what we're doing in One Mountain is sometimes we kind of do a kind of a Dharma talk, a presentation. Right? And sometimes we're thinking things through out loud together, because the purpose of One Mountain is to be kind of this locus focus of this revolution, which is this revolution in culture, this cultural revolution, which is an expression of cultural evolution. which comes from this realization that we're in a moment in history where we need to either love or die. Right? We're facing existential risk. We're at a time between stories and a time between worlds. Maybe somebody will put in the chat box an essay we call it Love or Die, which is we create it as the context for One Mountain, Many Paths. Right? So we're here to actually respond to existential risk and to be full human beings by telling a new story of value, by evolving the source code of consciousness and culture. And it's our knowing that actually it's only a new story of value at this time of metacrisis, at this time of existential risk. It's only a new story of value that will allow us to respond effectively and appropriately to the metacrisis. Now, it's that piece that I want to focus on this week in conversation, right, with my friend Yuval, right? It's that piece exactly. So I'm going to go through about maybe 15 steps, and I'm going to kind of try and take everyone kind of super slow, super relaxed. Here we go. Okay. So we're going to begin with, ready? Are we ready for a ride? Are we ready? Are we ready? Everybody, are we ready? That was a slow start. We're just kind of finding our way. Who's ready? I'm ready. Are you ready? Anybody ready here? Okay, here we go. So I'm going to start with Orwell. So George Orwell, 1984. And I think that there is a direct line between Orwell, writing 1984, right, which is the book about, totalitarian society, right? The phrase Orwellian, right? Orwellian society, right, has come to mean dictatorship, but a dictatorship, right, of a totalitarian nature. And at the very, very core, right, of Orwellian society is the utter deconstruction of story and the engagement in doublethink, right? Self-contradiction that happens consistently all the time. Okay, so that's called doublethink in Orwell's 1984, right? So I want to give you a description of doublethink because I think it describes the postmodern zeitgeist, of which Yuval is an uncontaminated expression, who is honest in that he's actually tipping his position, right? It is doublethink. And let me just do a parenthesis for a second. Are there things that Yuval says that are great? First of all, he's a great writer. A. Two, he's intelligent. B. 3, as I said before, I'm sure he's a beautiful guy. 3, but 4 is even more important. In other words, I have a longstanding argument with my colleague Jordan Peterson, where Jordan basically says postmodernity is idiocy. He traces postmodernity back to Marxism, not completely incorrectly. Right? There's a lot of truth in that, and because Marx's point was that it's all about power, that power is the only true reality, and language and story are just covers for the drive for power, which is kind of it's a fundamental Marxist idea, which actually was picked up by postmodernity. So Peterson says postmodernity is just bad news. That's actually incorrect. Postmodernity is bad news, but it's true. It's incorrect in the sense that it's true, but partial. In other words, postmodernity wildly overreached, reduced everything to just stories which are covers for power grabs. But postmodernity also did some really, really important things. And maybe in the last of this series, I'll talk about the 5 or 6 postmodern insights that are absolutely correct. And Yuval is a good expresser of those. But here's just one of them. There's a lot of stories that are bullshit. There's lots of stories that are fictions. And those fiction or fictive stories destroyed an enormous amount of reality. And there were dimensions of religions and governments, right, that actually told stories that were complete fictions, that were power drives or ways of imposing order. Those stories weren't true, and those stories caused enormous damage. And we need to be able to actually find reality itself and disambiguate ourselves, right? Free ourselves, disentangle ourselves from false narratives and fictive stories, right, that have dominated reality. That's a brilliant postmodern point. That was postmodernity's point. That's not Yuval's point. Yuval repeats that point. He does it, elegantly. But that's one of the core point, that's what postmodernity is all about. That's absolutely true. That's just true, right? That's true. It's a partial truth, but it's true. So I just wanted to say in general, right? Of course, there's much that's persuasive and interesting in reading Yuval. There's much that's persuasive and interesting in reading postmodernity, right? Yuval is an expression, right, of that postmodern moment. And that realization of postmodernity lives strongly at the leading edges of the interior sciences, right? It lives throughout an entire series of sources. Abraham Cook is a very good example of an interior scientist, right, who's deeply aware of that postmodern sensibility, right? He's a mystic writer, scientist, literary figure, political figure who dies in 1938. But actually, you see and feel realizations like that all through the leading edges of the interior sciences. And postmodernity really just picked up on them, in a very big way and brought them to the center and did an important job in bringing them to the center. But again, true, but very, 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 very partial. Okay, so I want to take that and kind of put that aside. Can I put that aside, everybody, for a second? Is that okay? I want to come back to our major theme. So we need, however, to be able to call out and utterly reject, to borrow Hegel's phrase, negate. We have to negate the fundamental fallacies of postmodernity that Yuval expresses, because they are root cause themselves for existential risk. And as they are root cause for the meta crisis, we've talked about extensively about why that's true in our book, First Principles and First Values. So I'm not going to go all the way into that right now, but just in a word, in order to respond to global challenges, we need global coordination. We can't have global coordination, we said, without global coherence and global resonance, which requires global intimacy. But there's a global intimacy disorder. Why? So the source of the global intimacy disorder is the failure to recognize each other in a shared field of value, right? Right. So if you basically deconstruct a shared field of value and meaning, right, then there's no conversation. Then you can't create intimacy, global intimacy, and you can't create global resonance, and you can't create global coherence, and you can't create global coordination, because you can only globally coordinate if you have kind of shared ordinating values. So therefore, you can't respond to global challenges in every dimension of the 13, 14 vectors of the meta crisis of existential risk is a global challenge, right, friends? Right, so just kind of get that. So there's a section in First Principles and First Values. Where's that book? It's someplace here. And I want to invite everyone, Mark Felix, my friend, write a review. We need your great review. I want to invite everyone to write a review of it, right? We super need help on that, right? Our goal is by Christmas to hit 100 reviews. Oh my God, right? Oh my God, to hit 100 reviews so we can get this book into culture. But there's a section, David, I shared that with you in our text thread, about the 7 links between existential risk and the collapse of a shared field of value. That's a major dimension of the story we're telling here. I'm not going to dedicate that this week to that. I want to focus on an entirely new set of points, but that's in the backdrop. And in the backdrop, in that Love or Die essay, that there's 7 clear structural links between the collapse of value, collapse of a shared field of value, right, and the meta crisis. That's critical. That's our backdrop. So if Harari tips the hand of postmodernity and says, right, or postmodernity says, there's any sense that you think that, meaning is real as a delusion, right? And he, in kind of, 25 passages, deconstructs the notion that there's any story which is a story of inherent value backed by the universe. Well, that is exactly the cause for the meta crisis, because if we can't create a shared story of value, how are we going to cohere? Does everyone get that? Let me do this slowly. I'm going to do this slowly. So I believe there's a direct line. Not I believe, I'm sure of it. There's a direct line, right? There's a direct line, right? And again, right, right? There's a direct line between one, the collapse of the field of value, and the meta crisis. So that's number one. But I'm delighted to discuss it further, right? So one. So now two. So if you take existential risk seriously, right? If you take existential risk seriously, right? Then postmodernity's collapse of value, which is cause for it, Foucault, just 10 passages in Foucault, 30 passages in Derrida. Right? If you take postmodernity's collapse of value or deconstruction of value seriously, right? Postmodernity is saying that value is just a figment of your imagination, just a fiction, right? Just a social construct. We're deconstructing value. That's postmodernity's basic move, which leads to directly, right, the meta crisis. So if you take that seriously, and paradoxically, as we pointed out last week, and Taylor, Christina Amlin began her Dharma recapitulation with this, right? Paradoxically, what Yuval and I agree on, and here Yuval is unique and distinct, many postmodern writers ignore the meta crisis. Yuval shares with us the utter seriousness of the meta crisis, and he wants to deal with it. He wants to engage it. And I actually would view his work as an attempt to engage the meta crisis. I think that's actually what he's doing in a real way. I think that's a great concern of his, and I share and feel him in that concern, and I think he feels us in that concern. Okay? But you can't, now track this. This is right now, we're starting an entirely new conversation now. But you can't have a story of value, which is going to respond to the meta crisis. What do? So this is a big deal, okay? And here's the second thing that Yuval and I agree on. We all agree on is that story is the most powerful force in reality. And that if you want to evolve the way human beings cooperate or cohere, you have to actually tell a new story. That is absolutely true. I've said that 1,000 times. Yuval has said it 1,000 times. We agree on it absolutely. If you want to evolve the way reality coheres, you have to tell a new story, a better story. We go deeper. So if there's a crisis of coherence, okay, now we're in new territory. Let's say this in a new way. If there's a crisis of coherence, how do you deal, my friends, Romans and countrymen, lend me your ears. How do we deal with a crisis of coherence? So both Yuval and us, Yuval and us, right? Yuval and our kind of entire enterprise here of cosmologic humanism, of telling a new story, right? We agree the way you deal with a crisis of coherence is you tell a new story. But here's the point. For Yuval, that new story is made up. It has to be. It can't be a story of value. It can't, because there is no story, because value is not real, right? Because claiming that any meaning is better than any other meaning is a pure fiction, right? A claim that he makes not once, not twice, not three times, not one text, right? In 50 texts. It's a clear position that goes all the way through. So then I want you to get it. And this is the next step. So he has no choice but to tell a new story, which is a made-up story, and to actually say the way we're going to cohere society is with a made-up story. Now, I just want you to get what a big deal that is, because that leads you to dictatorship, right? So there's a direct line, and I want to kind of try and show this clearly. There's a direct line between George Orwell, 1984, who talks about totalitarianism. Orwell is living at the same time as B.F. Skinner, who writes a book called Walden 2, which is what I would call soft totalitarianism. It's about placing reality in a hidden totalitarian box, what Skinner called an operant conditioning chamber, was popularly called a Skinner's box. Skinner was at Harvard for 6 decades. and was kind of the most prominent public culture figure. So Skinner's saying there's existential risk. So Skinner, good old us here on one mountain, Orwell, right? They're reading reality closely. Skinner got existential risk very clearly, very, very clearly. And Skinner's students at the MIT Media Lab, started by Alex Pentland, who are Skinner's hidden students, they also got existential risk very clearly. So when you read Skinner, what he's basically saying is, wow, I don't want to go down that Orwellian road of kind of Orwellian totalitarianism, what Skinner calls negative reinforcement, all sorts of forms of torture, right? And what's called the Ministry of Love, right? In Orwell's 1984. I don't want to go down that road. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through positive reinforcement. I'm going to generate a society which we invisibly control everyone. So it's invisible totalitarianism. And he viewed, at the end of his life, he viewed the World Wide Web as the means for enacting an invisible totalitarianism. And there's a book called The Bright Orange Globe by an independent scholar named Brian Deere, which is about the rise of the first systems of the web. One was called the Plato network, kind of the proto-web. And the key figure involved, the entire first chapter is about B.F. Skinner. Okay. Now, paradoxically, let's go really slow here, okay? So both Skinner and Orwell, right, are depicting a reality in which, for Skinner, value's not real, right? So we can't rely on value to cohere us. Skinner says in his chapter on values, for example, in his book Beyond Freedom and Dignity, he says value or the good is just positive reinforcement. It doesn't exist. He's very clear about it. Like Yuval, he doesn't pull the punch. But Yuval and Skinner completely agree. They agree on existential risk, and we agree with them on that. We're aligned on that. That's why it's such an important conversation. And Skinner and Yuval and Pentland at the MIT Media Lab, they agree really clearly there's no story of value that's real, right? It's all just stories. So therefore, Skinner's conclusion is, if I want to avoid China, a top-down totalitarianism, what I've got to do is I've got to create a benign, invisible totalitarianism where I'm kind of controlled and manipulated, his word, manipulated, shaped by, my desires are shaped by his word and Pentland's word, that I'm controlled by Skinner's word, but I'm controlled by invisible levers, just like rats and pigeons are controlled in a Skinner's box. Okay, that's the Skinnerian move. I believe that's the move that Yuval is moving towards, but give me a second. Yuval is actually sourced, though, first in Orwell. What does Orwell say? Now go really, really slow with me. Okay, let's go really slow. The way Orwell's portraying reality, he's basically saying as follows. What's going to happen is, in order to cohere reality, Big Brother or the Brotherhood or the party, right, or the Ministry of Love, which is the public face of the party, are going to create a story which becomes the story. So they're going to create a fictional story, and that story will become the story. Is that clear, everybody? Just who's got that clear? I just want to make sure we got that clear. That story will become the story. Now, why is that true? Why does that story have to become the story? Because there are no other stories of value. There's no story of value to disclose. And so the only way to actually control society is that the only people who get to create the story are the party. Only the party creates the story. No one else can create the story. There is no other story. And anyone who says that they're going to create a different story, even if they just believe it in their hearts, has to be crushed. Can I stay really close? Okay, really close. What would stand against that? What would stand against the crushing power of the totalitarian claim that all stories are fictions? Is everyone with me? What would stand against that? What would stand against that claim? What would anybody know what would stand against that? Anybody? What would stand against that? A love story, right? When you're in a love story, whatever form it is, there's many varieties of a love story. A love story stands against that. In a love story, you're in your own story and you're trusting your heart and you're trusting your body and you're trusting your allurement, your intellectual allurement, your embodied allurement, your allurement to sense making together, to talking to each other, your allurement to sensuality together. You trust your body. Your body becomes in your heart, right? In the field of feeling between the two cherubs above the Ark of the Covenant, the two sexually entwined cherubs, right? Above the Ark of the Covenant, or the two sensually entwined cherubs, or the two sensually intellectually entwined cherubs above the Ark of the Covenant. That's the story. It's the love story. That's where the word of God, meaning that's where we can feel it comes from in the classical lineage tradition of Solomon, meaning that's where there's a sense of truth. That's where there's a sense of a story that stands. So what's 1984 about? It's about a couple that has a love story, Winston and Julia. And they're madly in love with each other. And the entire point of the book is the ministry of love hijacks the love story. There are no love stories. Love stories don't exist independently of the ministry of love, because the love story is the one story that could challenge the authoritarian claim that we own stories, that all stories are fictional, and the only story that's true is the story that we made up. No other stories are true. That's the claim. The love story stands against it. In the love story, I trust my body, I trust my heart, I trust my feeling, I trust my heartstrings, I clarify my feeling, I clarify my sensuality, I clarify my sense making in the space between us. And so the entire apparatus of the party, embodied by O'Brien, who's the interrogator in 1984, is to crush the love story of Winston and Julia. Does everyone get that? Everybody get that? It's big. So, the assumption is, right, or the goal of the party is to ensure the betrayal of love, because that undermines the status or authority of the only story that could stand against the ministry of love. The ministry of love is hijacking all stories, including the love stories. Does everyone get that? So in 1984, there's this incredible scene, where Winston and Julia meet after they've betrayed each other. And I'll read it to you. It was by chance that they had met. It was in the park on a vile, biting day in March when the earth was like iron and all the grass seemed dead and there was not a bud anywhere except for a few crocuses which had pushed themselves up to be dismembered by the wind. You get the description of the day? And then, they see each other. And then Julia says, "I betrayed you," she said baldly. "I betrayed you," he said. She gave him another quick look of dislike. Sometimes, she said, they threaten you with something you can't stand up to, can't even think about. And then you say, "Don't do it to me, do it to somebody else, do it right to so-and-so, right? Do it to him." And perhaps you might pretend afterwards that it was only a trick and that you just said it to make them stop and didn't really mean it, but that isn't true. At the time when it happened, you do mean it. You think there's no other way of saving yourself, and you're quite ready to save yourself that way. You want it to happen to the other person. You don't give a damn what they suffer. All you care about is yourself. All you care about is yourself, he echoed. And after that, you don't feel the same towards the other person any longer. She said, No, he said, you don't feel the same. Right? Does everyone get that? Right? That's the goal of 1984. Right? Winston's not killed. It's a misreading. Winston's not killed at the end of 1984. They talk about killing. What they mean is they killed the old Winston. They set him loose. They set him free because his love has been hijacked. He now loves only Big Brother. The love story itself has been hijacked. There's only the contrived story. No other story exists. That's the great lie of 1984. It's not true. Actually, love is often as strong as death, as the Song of Songs right, points out, as the Solomon tradition points out, and often, right, we stand for love, even in the face of enormous suffering, and we sacrifice for love, right? The assumption that the human being, right, is an empty mechanical vessel that can be molded and shaped and controlled and made to move, right, through the motivational architecture of a fictive story, of a fictitious story, which is always more powerful than anything else, because there is no true love story, is a lie. That's the great lie, right? Love actually is more powerful. The love story is more real. But Winston and Julia, right, are portrayed, right, in this story, right, as the betrayers, right? They betray the love, and the party's victorious because the party now owns the apparatus of story. Does everyone get that? It's like, wow. Wow. Now, Skinner doesn't disagree with that portrayal of culture in Orwell, that there is no story that's real. But what Skinner says is, don't use negative reinforcement, which is what the Ministry of Love uses in 1994. He says, use positive reinforcement in 40 different passages. Positive reinforcement, I'm going to invisibly control you by actually hijacking love stories and making them banal. Call it St. Valentine's Day, right? We'll make love mean very little. You'll say, I love you, but it won't really mean anything, right? We'll say, I love you, but we'll lose connection to what it means. We'll hijack romantic love as a tool of subservience, right? And we'll create a Skinner's box in which everyone lives, and they respond to likes and views on the web, and they're moved right through this kind of strange, superficial, motivational architecture, which is about the lowest common denominator of human beings being moved around, manipulated, right? Human beings become, in Skinner's phrase, observable and manipulable through the vehicles of the World Wide Web. And that's not just a MAGA move, right? We always think propaganda is on the other side, my friend. That's not just a MAGA move. There's a lot of that happening in MAGA, and there's a lot of that happening, right, in the Democratic Party, right? Propaganda is all over the map, right? We always think that our side's right and the other side's propagandizing. It's more complex. It's more complex. It's more subtle, right? Propaganda exists in many forms. I've got to get beneath propaganda, right, into a shared story, right, into a shared story. Now, in step one. So that's like part one new. That's Orwell. Now I'm gonna go step 2, 3, and 4, and it's wild. So now, what does the party do? The party engages in what we called doublethink. We referenced it before. Now, how does doublethink work? Hey, Clyde, it's good to see you, man. Okay, Dorothea, great to see you. Okay, so how does doublethink work? This is the deconstruction of story. So Orwell has a bunch of descriptions of doublethink. I want to just read you 2 of them for a second. To tell deliberate lies while genuinely believing in them, right? And that's often true about my friend Yuval, right? He says things that are clearly not the case, right? Claims, which if he would just, he's intelligent, he would be like, that's not true. I just overreached, for example, in my deployment of science. It's not true. But you tell the lie while you believe in it, to forget any fact that has become inconvenient. This is Orwell. And then when it becomes necessary again, to draw it back from oblivion for just so long as it is needed, to deny the existence of objective reality, meaning an objective narrative structure of reality of value, and all the while to take account of reality, which one denies. All this is indispensably necessary. Did that spin your mind? It should have. It spins your mind. Even to read about doublethink spins your mind, right? To know and not to know, to be conscious of complete truthfulness while telling carefully constructed lies, but not even to quite realize you're doing it. To hold simultaneously 2 opinions which canceled out, knowing them to be contradictory and believing in both of them. To use logic against logic. To repudiate morality while laying claim to it. Right? And above all, to apply the same process to the process itself. That was the ultimate subtlety. consciously to induce unconsciousness, and then once again to become unconscious of the act of hypnosis you have just performed. Even to understand the word doublethink involved the use of doublethink. Whoa, right? Whoa, incredible text, right? And you literally get that sense of Harari, right? I'll just give you one example. I'm just going to give you just one simple example, okay? So Yuval's writing about free will, okay? Right? Yuval's writing about free will. And he writes an article in The Guardian where he says, I'm going to take the unpopular position because it's true. Free will is absolutely not real in any sense at all. Okay? Or if you open, Yuval's book, Homo Deus, and you open to the chapter called The Time Bomb in the Laboratory. Okay, just to give you one sense of it, I'll read you one paragraph, right? Page 329, if you want to check it out. To the best of our scientific understanding, determinism and randomness have divided the entire cake between them, leaving not even a crumb for freedom. There is no free will. The sacred word freedom turns out to be just like soul, a hollow term, empty of any discernible meaning. Free will exists only in the imaginary stories. Free will exists only in the imaginary stories we human beings have made up. That's a big claim. Free will does not exist. That's a consistent Yuval position. Okay? Fair? On the other hand, okay, and this is almost funny if it wasn't tragic and confusing and doublethink. So, for example, right, Lena, do you remember when we started thinking about the Ukraine war that you spoke about a few months ago and we wrote a little book about, right? When we started thinking about the Ukraine war, right, and the terrible attack of Putin on the Ukraine. So Yuval wrote a whole bunch of articles, right, around the world. And the articles all began with, we have a choice here. Human beings have choices to make. In his new book, Nexus, all through the book, even on the back of the book, the way they summarized the book, and clearly his team was involved in it, but it's all through the book. And this is all about the urgent choices we now must make. I'm a little confused, my friend. So you just told us that choice doesn't exist. You just told us that choice doesn't exist, right? In a series of articles as a major chapter in your book, Homo Deus. And then, right, your next book is all about the choices we need to make, right? And every article you write about key moments is about the human capacity to make choices. Hello. Do you think we're idiots? So he doesn't think we're idiots, right? Do you get what I'm saying? He doesn't actually. He doesn't think we're idiots. He's engaged to repudiate morality while laying claim to it. This is the confusion here. That's why it's confusing, right? It's why you can go back and forth. What's he doing? It's confusing. Well, but he seems to be standing for value in some way, right? But then he's kind of saying it's not real. That is how doublethink operates, to repudiate morality while laying claim to it. Yuval is actually an incredibly accurate representation of this exact experience of doublethink. Because, okay, now let's go to the next point, point 3, right? Because Yuval's recognizes, like we do, like the Orwellian Ministry of Love did, like B.F. Skinner does, that we're actually facing existential risk in a real way. So I want you to get how much this matters. So if you actually get that, our colleague Shoshana Zuboff essentially mocks Skinner in her book Surveillance Capitalism. It's a huge mistake. Skinner is not to be mocked. Jaron Lanier is a very good writer on the techplex, who's actually he's not a cultural historian, he's actually an engineer, but he mocks Skinner. Just calls Skinner creepy, right? Nicholas Carr, in his book The Shallows, mocks Skinner. No, Skinner's not to be mocked. First off, he was a towering intellect, but 2, he was actually genuinely moved by existential risk. If you read C.S. Lewis's 1943 book, The Abolition of Man, which is basically a critique of Skinner, although Skinner's not mentioned by name, Lewis actually takes Skinner seriously in a way that Zuboff didn't and all the later writers haven't. and actually gets, oh, this is serious, and he actually gets correctly that Skinner is deeply concerned with existential risk. Or what are we going to do? And so basically, the Orwellian ministry of love, excuse me, right? The Orwellian ministry of love, that form of totalitarianism, right, which says no stories are real. So therefore, what we have to do is we have to take control of the narrative mechanism, utterly crush any illusion of a story that could stand against it, and we create the story, and then we organize reality through our created story. Okay? Yeah, let's go deeper. Skinner says we organize reality through invisible levers of control that create this illusion of a lowest common denominator story that you live and everybody's happy. Right? When you read Walden 2, you get a little bit of a sense of the Stepford Wives. And in Walden 2, just like in 1984, what is dismissed is Eros sexuality. Right? There's essentially, Walden 2 is essentially a sexless book. It's a book devoid of Eros as well, right? Sex models Eros, doesn't exhaust Eros. Eros exists for 12 billion years, but Eros is the force of Eros value that coheres cosmos, and sex is one expression of it. There's only one figure, right, in Walden 2 that's sexual in any way, whose name is Barbara. Barbara is the girlfriend of a guy named Rogers. Rogers is one of the two students of a guy named Professor Burrus, right, who comes to visit Walden 2. And all of Walden 2 is a conversation between Fraser, who's the founder of Walden 2, who represents Skinner and Burrus. And Burrus has these two students with their girlfriends that come with him. One of them is Rogers, whose girlfriend is Barbara. Barbara is sexual, right? But her sexuality is what in the end leads Rogers away from Walden 2, prevents him from seeing the truth, and sends him back to the rat race of society. So the one figure in Walden 2 who's in any way sexual, right, is a kind of sexuality is presented as a kind of siren song, which is in the way. In general, in Walden 2, teenage sex is strongly promoted, and in having babies early just to get sex and babies out of the way. Let's not get disturbed by that, so we get on to kind of the real business of being creative and happy in the world, right? So there's a complete sidelining and rejecting throughout Skinner of any sense, right, that sex, Eros, or love is real, right? Skinner says explicitly twice in Walden 2, love is but a positive reinforcer. Love is not real, right? So both Skinner rejects the love story. The ministry of love, right? So Skinner and Walden 2 rejects the love story. The ministry of love rejects the love story. And Skinner's deeply aware of this parallel between him and Orwell. And Skinner writes a book called, in 1984, he writes a sequel to Walden 2 called News from Nowhere, in which Orwell fakes his death and comes to live in Walden 2 under the name Blair. And then there's a whole set of conversations between Blair and Fraser. And what Skinner suggests is that both Blair and Fraser agree, Blair being the Orwell figure, Fraser being the Skinner figure, they both agree that love and Eros are not real. Wow. Wow. And so there's a direct line between the Orwellian position, the Skinnerian position, both based on Orwell particularly, but Skinner as well as on doublethink. In Skinner, excuse me, it's not exactly doublethink, it's closer to euphemism. He does the same thing. And one of the classical features of Skinner and of the techplex is euphemism. So for example, we're not trying to addict people. That would be insane. Why would we addict people to the web? That would be gross and repulsive. So instead of using the word, we never talk about addicting people, but actually the goal of the web is addiction. And actually Nir Eyal, the kind of icon of Silicon Valley, writes a book early on, an uncontaminated book as well, where he kind of tips his hat like Harari does in our field. And the name of the book is Hooked, Hooked, Hooked. It's the name of the book. Okay. There's another book about how addiction takes place through the web, which is called Fear No Evil, I believe, right? With a kind of black and red cover, right? So instead of calling it addiction, it's called engagement. The idea is to engage customers. There's this notion of engagement. And there's actually about 25 major euphemisms, right, that define the web that cover up the move of control. So for example, Pentland doesn't talk about putting people in a Skinner's box. He talks about turning reality into living laboratories. That's his word for a Skinner's box, right? So there's this euphemism, which is its own form of it's a kind of euphemism. It's not exactly doublethink. It's Skinner's form, right, of the kind of the degradation of language. In other words, what both Orwell and Skinner share is the need to degrade language. It's only the degradation of language, which becomes the degradation of story as story of value, that allows you to claim language and claim story as your own in order to effect control. That is what Yuval's doing. Now, stay with me, okay? Right, and if just 3 people stay, I'm good, okay? Because I want to. This is like this is about. We're going to make this huge, crazy leap now, but it's really insanely important. So here we go. So what's Yuval's argument? So if you look at his new book. Oh God, I'm doing the wrong new book here. We should be telling people to buy First Principles and First Values, and here I am kind of selling Yuval's book. Okay, First Principles and First Values. Buy a book and write a review. Thank you. Okay, did I do that well? Did anyone think I did that well? No one thinks I did that well. Okay, so here's 2 books. This is Harari's new book. Okay, the key chapter in what I'm talking about right now is chapter 2. Okay, but here we're going to get a little creepy here. Okay, we're going a little creepy here. Here we go. Here's another book by Harari. You're not going to believe this. This is a fucking children's book. The children's book, right? Oriana, I apologize. Okay, this is a freaking children's book. This children's book this is what he's saying to children, right? It's called Unstoppable Us. And his question is, in this children's book, how did humans take over the world? And he is consistent in his children's book. I was hoping that in his children's book, he would pull the punch and tell children that, I don't know, the good, the true, and the beautiful are actually valid and have value and are important. He doesn't. Again, he's uncontaminated material, and he's honest all the way in a particular way, even as he's completely intellectually dishonest, because that's the nature of doublethink, but he's also honest. It's doublethink. So here we go, right? Unstoppable Us, How Humans Took Over the World, which is a restatement, essentially, for children, right, of, what he says in this book, which is a restatement of what he says in Sapiens chapter 2. It's a restatement of what he says in the chapter called Storytellers and Homo Deus, and the chapter in Homo Deus called Human Spark. It's a restatement of the last 2 chapters of a book called 21 Questions, right? And it's all doublethink. So for example, in the book, and I'm going to get to the point in a second, but I want to just give you one last example of doublethink. So he opens up 21 Questions. He talks about the 3 great stories of the 20th century, whatever they are. Then he says, none of those worked. He's correct about that. That's a good historical overview. Clearly, he ends we need a new story. That's how he ends chapter 1. It's like, great. And Terry, I remember, Terry, when I recommended that book a few years ago, Terry Nelson, you wrote me and said, oh my God, this is awesome. But he gets it. Harari gets it. Remember, Terry, when you wrote me that email? And then, I'm just checking if Terry's here. Terry, do you remember that? Yep. We got a yep from Terry. Okay. Just say I'm not doing doublethink, not making that up. Then, when he gets to the end of the book, his last 2 chapters are basically a bad Buddhist Dharma talk. Sorry, Yuval, right? It's kind of a vapid Vipassana Dharma talk. Sorry again, Yuval, right? Where he basically says, why are you lost in story? Story's not real. Stories are utterly, totally, and completely made up, right? Do you remember last week when we did a clip, right, of Yuval from his interview with Lex Friedman, and Friedman asked, okay, what's the meaning of life? And Yuval said, the one thing it's not is a story. It's not a story, right? And there are about 6 clips I was going to play today, but I didn't because of time, where basically Yuval talks again and again and again about the utterly and absolutely, right, made up, I'm looking for one of the clips now, right, utterly and absolutely made up nature, right, of stories. Okay, now it's going to start getting interesting. Okay, now it gets interesting. So stay with me. So Yuval gets existential risk, but there's no stories of value to fall back on. So you have no choice but to make up a story. Now let's go a couple of more steps. Yuval's argument is that there are two kinds of stories. There are a few stories that stories can actually convey truth, where a story, which is a technology of information, conveys some level of truth, and clearly that's obviously true. And there are stories that convey some degree of truth. But he says most stories in culture don't. Most stories are utterly fictional, completely made up. And then he says, now, lest you challenge that, let me point out that the major stories in culture, we believe them, even though they're not true. The fact that we believe a story doesn't mean that it's true. The story is made up, and yet you can get people to believe them. Does that sound like 1984? It should. But let's keep going. So what's his evidence for that? So he quotes evidence, and everyone assumes he's right. He makes what appears to be on the surface a very powerful point, which is why Barack Obama and Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos ad infinitum all endorse the book. Right? This is the postmodern point. Again, Taylor, it's not the Yuval point. This is the postmodern point. And in our Dharma recap next week, let's kind of say Yuval / postmodernity, late modernity, postmodernity. Okay? So he says, take the Catholic Church, okay? Or the Bible. Those are two examples he uses. So he says, the Bible gets so many facts wrong. The Bible claims that, people emerged from Mesopotamia, human beings. But if we know anthropology, we know that everybody was for 25,000 years on the savannah in Africa, and they didn't come from Mesopotamia. So this is a fictional story. Or, the Bible says, when you engage pestilence, you got to pray. And we don't do prayer, we do penicillin. So the Bible got it completely wrong. So the Bible's wrong. It's a fictional story, and yet everyone buys into it. Second example he has is the Catholic Church. Catholic Church has 1.4 billion people who are members of the Catholic Church. And just between us, you really believe that she was a virgin, Mary? Or that Jesus was born of immaculate conception? That there was virginity postpartum? That's what they call it in kind of formal doctrine. Do we really believe in virginity postpartum? Hello? Really? There's a whole list of things, right, which are clearly fictions that were presented by the Catholic Church that clearly weren't true, and yet everybody, 1.4 billion people, believe in some version of this. He's got lots of other examples. His point is, these are fictional stories, and people will absolutely believe in a fictional story, which is, again, the claim of the party in 1984. It's a little chilling. Okay, now, stay close. Is Yuval right? He's not. He's not. People don't believe in these stories because they're fictional. That's not why it's just dead wrong. He just got it totally wrong. Okay, so I want to go slow for a second. Here's the argument. Let me kind of lay out the argument that's made by historians that Yuval adopts well. All right, here's the first part of the argument. So we have a world, and Scott, you and I talked about this yesterday. We have a world filled with many genesis, many types of human beings. So, for example, one of the types of human beings that lived 70, 80,000 years ago were Neanderthals. Who recognizes the phrase when we were kids and you hear your mother say about someone or your father, he's a Neanderthal? That was not a compliment. The assumption was that Neanderthals were somehow subhuman, as it were. Right? We realized that wasn't true. Then new anthropological evidence kind of comes on board and realized Neanderthals actually have great art and fascinating sexuality and kind of deep rituals and all that kind of good stuff. So why did the Neanderthals disappear? Why did the sapiens become so much more powerful than the Neanderthals? So anthropology points out, right, historical cultural anthropology, that what happened about 50,000 years ago is language. So Homo sapiens got language, and language allowed them to communicate in a new way. So there's a whole school of anthropology that says, what did language do? It allowed them to do the hunt better, right? They could kind of talk to each other and prepare for the hunt and share the different trails of the bison and the antelope and the deers. And that's possible. And there's a whole schools of thought that adopt that. And there's more powerful schools that reject that. Harari goes correctly, I believe, with the rejection of that and says that language is not just about sharing, communicating information about the hunt, which confers a survival advantage, right? Harari says, no, it's about something much deeper, right? It's much deeper. I'm kind of going over the the general line of argument in Harari. He says, well, actually, language is doing something much deeper. What's language doing? Language is giving us the capacity to tell a story. Now, this is very important, okay? So the argument is as follows. The reason the Neanderthals disappeared is because Neanderthals only banded together in these small groups of people because they didn't have language that had a storytelling capacity. So therefore, as the sociologist Robin Dunbar pointed out, I think his first name is Robin, it might not be, right? There's something which became called the Dunbar number, which is that you can only be intimate with about 150 people. And you can actually check that out yourself. It's very hard to know more than 150 people and have a direct relationship with them and feel like you can trust them, that you know them, you can rely on their word, you have enough intimacy to coordinate together, to cohere together, right? To resonate together, right? Right? Coordination, right? Coherence, resonance, right? Everyone with me? So Neanderthals could only coordinate, cohere, resonate at the level of the Dunbar number. Does that make sense? But sapiens, this is the argument of anthropology that's adopted by Harari, right? That he kind of presents as true. Sapiens, they could cohere through storytelling. So they became, stay close with me, they became cohered, not through knowing each other directly, intimately. They became cohered. Coherence was generated because they all met in a shared story. That's his big move. So if you have a shared story, you could have not 150 sapiens, you could have not 50 sapiens like you had Neanderthals, which were between 50 and 150 maximum. You could have 500 sapien humans, 1,000 sapien humans, which meant that you have 500 times the firepower, 500 times the innovation power, 500 times the creativity power, 500 times the mind power, right? And it's a whole different world. Then you have 1,000 sapiens, and then you have 10,000 sapiens in the savannah, which are all in different places, which all know each other. And so when there's a drought or a famine, you're connected to this larger sapien community, so you don't get wiped out. You go and stay with your relatives, as it were. So what he's basically saying is, he's repeating this anthropological argument, and he repeats it eloquently, that the capacity of having a shared story creates the sense of family, the sense of coherence, right? The sense of coordination that the Neanderthals didn't have, right? Even though, here's the big point, even though the stories are fiction. So not true. That's what he tells the kids, right? In this book. This book is, the entire book's about this. I stayed up a few nights ago reading this whole book, right? This whole book, right? He tells the kids, even though the stories aren't true, nonetheless, our superpower is to tell stories. Our superpower is to tell stories. And we have this capacity that animals don't have and shouldn't have. We actually have this weird capacity to believe things that aren't true. Why? Because we want to cohere. So we're willing to believe this not true story and to get intimate with each other through the story because it makes us more powerful. And here I'm going to explicate the part that Harari kind of hides, meaning a story is an instrument of power. It coheres us and it makes us more powerful, even though it's a fictive story. That's his point. So his point is, stories are not true. Fictive stories, right, meaning not all stories, but most stories that cohere us are not true. But stories don't need to be true to cohere us. It's this strange mechanical blip in reality that stories have this coherent capacity. Why? Because we meet each other and kind of trust each other, know each other in the story, just because, right? We all know the same story. We feel this common bond of story. Wow, we have the shared family history. History as in his story. Okay? That's his move. Okay, that is categorically not the case. That's not how story works. Okay, and let's go one more step. Okay, one more step. What Harari misses is something essential about the nature of how intimacy is created through story. So let's take the Catholic Church story, or let's take the biblical story. So Harari says, well, these stories are fictions and everybody's cohering and believing them. Not exactly. More accurate, let's start with the Catholic Church, okay? Let's be clear, I am not a big fan of the Catholic Church. I am not a fan of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church is one of the most corrupt institutions that reality has ever created, and has a level of decadence and corruption that's actually shocking. And here's the and part of the story that the Catholic Church is telling is freaking beautiful. It's telling a story about, wow, virginity and innocence, and our ability to revirginate, right, and to kind of birth from this place of our innocence, right? It's telling a story about this force in reality that loves us so crazy much, outrageously, that there's some dimension of reality, the ultimate source of reality, that holds us in every moment, right? That's willing to die for us on the cross, that's willing to get nailed to the cross for the sake of our liberation, that I'm so radically loved and held, right, that there's some force in reality that wants my liberation desperately. Or the Sermon on the Mount, right? This stand for justice and for the orphan and for the widow, right? This story of true virtue, right? Of true noble virtue, right? And the New Testament is filled with, I have a picture on my wall of a beautiful version of Luke 15, painted by Lane, of the prodigal son, right? Right? In other words, the Catholic story is filled with gorgeous, resonant truths and a lot of fiction. But the reason people resonate with the story is because we recognize ourselves in the story, okay? And I respond to the story because I recognize I meet myself in the story, okay? Now, I want to give an example. Crazy, crazy, crazy important to get this. Here we go. Okay, give us this clip. So what happened? Why did everyone believe the music? Right? Now you've got this square, right? Everyone's kind of on a Sunday in a square, kind of in the middle of Sicily, Italy, having their ordinary kind of somewhat dull malaise, day filled with the normal pettiness and contraction and argument, and everyone's doing what they do. And then this music starts to gradually fill up, right? You feel that? This music starts to gradually fill everything up. And what happens? Everyone's blown away, right? Everyone's kind of blown out of their minds. They're like, oh my God. And everyone responds to the music. Why? Because the musical value, the cadence of the music, right? The tempo of the music, the stops and the starts, right? The pattern of intimacy that's created by music, which is part of the manifest universe. Music is part of one of the features of the manifest. It's the interior mathematics of intimacy of cosmos, right? Within the world of time and the pacing of time. But that music lives inside of us. We participate in that music. So we don't need someone to explain the truth of that music. That music lives in us. The reason that music changes us and moves us and shapes us is because we are resonant with the music. That's why music is a form of information. It informs us. Story is an information technology because story, like music, right, capacitates us to, as it were, march in unison. We get to kind of march together, right? Because we recognize, we cohere, right, to the musical value. There are values in music. There's musical value, right? Beethoven's Fifth, da 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 da, right? It's a particular value. It's a particular quality, and we resonate with that quality. So just like there's musical value, and there's mathematical value, right? There's Eros value, right? Moral value, Eros value. And so when we tell the story of Christmas, we're not cohering around a fictional story like a bunch of idiots because maybe Santa's not true. I think Santa's true, just for the record. Just saying. I met Santa once, actually. Just between us. Okay, but putting that aside, okay? So we're cohering because we resonate with Christmas. And I was raised in my life as an Orthodox rabbi. I love Christmas. I resonate with Christmas, right? I resonate as a Catholic with the Catholic Church, not because I'm an idiot, right, who kind of believes in these dogmas, which are fictional, and these dogmas are fictional, just because there's this mechanical thing that we all meet in the story. No, we're intimate in the story because we're having a shared anthro-ontological experience. We're having a shared experience of resonance. And we look at each other when we realize, oh my God, we're resonating together. It's like when a family gets together and nothing holds them together but the old jokes. And then they find each other in the old jokes. They resonate through the old jokes. No, we resonate through shared feeling, right? That's that scene. I was talking about it yesterday, right? We date ourselves. Richard Gere, the movie Pretty Woman, Julia Roberts, and she's a courtesan and he falls in love with her. And it's a love story, just like Winston and Julia in 1984. And he's not sure is she sophisticated enough for him, right? He's right, but he loves her. And they go to this very, very, very beautiful, subtle opera symphony. And he's crying. He's like, oh my God, and he looks over. And she gets even more deeply. There's a tear running down her cheek. And as he looks at her, he realizes, oh my God, right? She's having the same feeling that I'm having. And they're intimate because they're participating in the same feeling. And so we resonate in a shared story, not because there's a blip of a materialist cosmos, which causes this mechanical misfunction or function, unclear, which causes people world over to cohere information, to cohere information, in-formation, to inform ourselves, right, to resonate, to cohere through story. And there's an enormous amount of evidence of that. And Harari is aware of the evidence. He cites some of it. No, the reason that we cohere through story is because in story, we're literally intimate with each other because we're having a shared experience of value. Intimacy is based on shared value. We're having a shared experience of value. We're having a shared experience of Eros value. Richard Gere and Julia Roberts are watching the symphony and the tear is rolling down her cheek. And he realizes she's feeling what I'm feeling. That's why sensuality is so powerful. It's why making love together is so powerful. It's why sometimes couples have this, weird idolatry. Let's not go down this road, but there's this weird idolatry, but it's rooted in something beautiful, which is, right, when they're involved in sexing, right, they have this desire to actually explode at the same time. Why? Because we want the intimacy of shared feeling. And again, it's not about orgasm. The sexual model's Eros. You can have sex your whole life and never be intimate, and never have sex and be totally intimate. Okay, so I don't want to, right? But the point is that this notion of the shared explosion, the shared tear, is that we meet in the depth of a shared intimacy. That's why stories cohere us. Stories cohere us because we actually participate together in shared value. And it's the same reason the Bible coheres people. The Bible doesn't cohere people because it's a fictional story that got an anthropological or medical fact wrong. The Bible coheres people because it speaks, right, a language of prophetic justice. It speaks a language of beauty. It speaks a language of family, right? It speaks and family conflict and resolution and vulnerability and agony, right, and ecstasy, and right. And as we recognize ourselves, we locate ourselves, we participate in the story, we recognize each other because we understand that we're actually participating in the same story. I'm like, wow. Okay. Last step. Last step is a big step. Here's the last piece. I mean, it's gorgeous. So why? Here we go. Ready? So now everything we're doing becomes clear. What are we saying? We're saying there's a crisis. This is how we began today. We're saying there's a crisis of coherence. And we're saying, oh, you can't respond to a crisis of coherence. The meta crisis of existential risk is a crisis of coherence. We're calling it a global intimacy disorder. And we're saying that a failure, this global intimacy disorder, is based on a failure to articulate a shared story of value meaning. Right? Wow. And there's 7 links between a failure to articulate a shared story of value meaning and existential risk. Okay? So what we're saying is, hello, value meaning is real. It's evolving. There are fictional stories that need to be exploded. The postmodern explosion of, power motives and dominance motives and false stories is good. We receive and integrate that postmodern insight. We share that with Yuval. But underneath all that, there actually are shared stories of value because reality is a story, right? In other words, Yuval, you forget, my friend, to answer the following question, right? Why is it true that story coheres us? What is it about story that coheres us? Why don't we have, I don't know, why don't we have jumping jacks? I do jumping jacks when we get coherent through jumping jacks, through doing exercise together, which we don't. Why don't we get coherent by riding bikes together? And I know these are bad examples, but the point is, why does story cohere us? Story coheres us because the value of story, both the values that story holds and the value of story itself, lives inside of us. It's because, and we'll talk about this more next week, but reality is a story. Reality has a narrative arc, and reality is a story of value. And that story of value lives inside of me. And again, we're talking about, that's part 2 next week. But story coheres me because story lives inside of me. And the value that story is telling, that value lives inside of me, just like the musical value does. So when we say in One Mountain, we say, right, there's this crisis of coherence, not enough to do new infrastructure. Do the next sentence for me. You all know the next sentence, right? Figure out how to find, right, bioweapons in the wastewater, the example I always give. Not enough to do new social structure. Everybody knows the next sentence, right? New regulation, for example. That's not enough. In other words, in some sense, Skinner and Pentland are all about new infrastructure and social structure. That's the only thing that's going to change us. And let's create new infrastructure. Let's turn the world into a Skinner's box, which is, let's do that through data science. Data science is new infrastructure. A Skinner's box, Walden 2, right? A kind of invisible levers of control, controlling the immersive environment of a World Wide Web. That's new social structure. So both Skinner and Pentland, they get existential risk and they say, we're going to solve it through new infrastructure and social structure. But they've got no other move. Why? Because what they're saying is there is no real story of value, so that's not going to work. We're saying, yeah, there is. There is a new story of value, right? Because actually, story evolves. Our stories of value evolve. And when I have a crisis of coherence, right, I got to tell a new story of value that it generates more coherence. Does everyone get that sentence? Let me give you an example. Let's say you have an intimacy disorder between a couple. Right? So they got to go back to their story of value and first create a new story, recreate their story of value. What's the story of value between us? And then they might realize, oh, there's part of me that's been split off. There's part of value that's been split off. We need to deepen our story of value, right? Maybe there's a dimension of my creativity that was split off, which is part of the value of who I am that hasn't been on the table, hasn't been recognized. Let's bring that into the story, right? And maybe there's some really important fears of mine, right, that haven't been honored, and actually holding them in vulnerability and authenticity is a huge value that's been split off. Let's make that part of our story. So I deepen my story of intimacy by deepening the value that makes up the story. And then I tell this new story of value together, and then we create new coherence between the couple. That's always, and there's always something split off, right? So the new story of value of modernity said, oh, wow, we've split off, right? Empirical methods of information gathering and the scientific method itself got split off, and new ways of doing art, right, got split off, right, et cetera, et cetera. And we got to bring that value into the new story. Let's tell a new story of value, which is going to create greater coherence, right, which actually new laws of science, which create all of the dignities of modernity. So when we're facing a meta crisis, existential risk at a time between stories, a time between worlds, Zach calls it. I call it a time between stories. We need to tell a new story of value because a story of value generates new coherence. Why? Because a story of value is always a story of Eros value, right? Eros value. It's always a story of Eros. Now, last step. What is Eros? Eros equals the experience of radical aliveness. This is the interior science equation of Eros in the First Principles and First Values book, which is core to cosmoerotic humanism. Eros equals the experience of radical aliveness, desiring ever deeper contact, and ever greater wholeness. What is that? Coherence. In other words, the Eros equation is an equation that demonstrates that reality is always seeking greater Eros value, which means greater coherence, right? Deeper contact and greater wholeness. Greater wholeness means the split off parts are now included in the story of value. So this new story of value creates more coherence. So for example, let's add a story of value in the medieval period, which was ethnocentric. I only love me and my tribe. Too much is split off. I've got to expand to world-centric, and then I got to expand to cosmocentric. Let me include the animals, right? But whenever something is split off, right, then we get lost. Or let's say we're so evolutionary that we think we're always progressing, and we forget actually the very important deep value that the ancients had. So we split that off. No, we need to include that, right? In other words, nothing can be left off the table. No one and nothing is outside of the story, right? We've got to deepen our story of value, but it's a story of real inherent value. And one of the things that gets most split off is, in the postmodern story, value itself. The reality of value is split off. So it becomes just a story, not a story of value, because value meaning itself is contrived. And you're accused, if you believe that you have any meaning to your life, Harari, it's a delusion. You think value meaning is real, it's a fiction, it's an imagined reality, it's a social construct. So you've split off from the story value itself. So if you split off from the story value itself, then it's all just a story. That's Harari's position. That's the position of 1984. That's why there's so much doublethink in 1984, and that's why there's so much doublethink in Harari, right? Because value's been split off, so it's just a story. And the story's fiction. And Harari says, but it's okay, because fictional stories will cohere reality, fictional stories will cohere reality even if there's nothing true in them. Wow. That is a recipe for dictatorship. That's frightening. That's frightening. That's frightening. And here is, and I mean this tenderly, Yuval, here's where the people who are afraid that Yuval is aligning with what seem to be the less noble impulses of, let's say, the World Economic Forum and Klaus Schwab, who speak in the language of turning reality into a Skinner's box, and Yuval kind of becomes a little bit of their spokesperson, right? So people are like, right? And they're not sure why they think that, and they can't quite work it out, but they're just disturbed. Yuval, what are you saying? And then everyone says, no, you didn't say that. No, Yuval, you're doing a little double think here, right? Right? You're telling us it's all about story. You're telling us value meaning is not real, meaning you're echoing postmodernity. And then you're telling, hey, but here's the superpower, right? This is your book. You tell all the kids, what's our superpower? Our superpower is that we can cohere reality by what? By fictional stories. And if there's a problem in reality, he says this in all of his books, including this book, he says it all over the place, right? He says, and here's the human superpower. The human superpower is, right, people need stories, even if they're fictional stories, in order to cooperate, right? I'm on page 71, but they can change the way they cooperate by changing the stories they believe. Meaning you can change that's our superpower. That's why we're far more powerful than ants, right? We can change our fictional story, impose it on reality, and cohere reality through a new fictional story. Welcome to Orwellian totalitarianism, or Skinnerian totalitarianism, you choose. Okay? And that's why Yuval gets a little confused. He's kind of like, I really kind of think China's doing a really good job. There's all sorts of kind of like refusal to recognize the problematics of China. And again, I think we need to embrace China. We need to talk to China. China needs to be part of the conversation. We can't just other China. Right? Everyone's got to be at the table. Everyone's got to be at the table, right? Of course, but you have to be able to distinguish, to make distinctions, right? You got to be able to make distinctions, not to whitewash one position, but to make distinctions. And to make distinctions, you make distinctions between stories. But Yuval's not willing to do that. He says the person going to the Middle East, right, in order to slaughter Muslims from a particular town in England, and the person going from the same town in England, this is in Homo Deus, the person going to the same town in England to work for Amnesty International, they're both just functions of their story, and there's no essential difference in terms of value meaning between them. That's shocking. That's frightening. That is cause for existential risk. Certainly cause for the existential risk, which is the death of our humanity. Right? The failure, right, to actually enact a world in which human freedom, which human choice, and which human dignity is protected. And Yuval is very much a mixture of a kind of Orwellian and Skinnerian. Skinner's name of Skinner's book is Beyond Freedom and Dignity. What we're saying here at One Mountain is in direct response to this. We're saying, no. Actually, you don't, let me say it this way. For Yuval, a new story is actually not a new story of value. It's a new infrastructure, social structure. Do you get that? If I can borrow Harris's terms from cultural materialism, right? Harris has this term, superstructure, culture structure, and infrastructure. Superstructure, social structure, and infrastructure. So social structure and infrastructure, we talked about earlier. For Yuval, stories a form of infrastructure and social structure. We're saying no, story is a form of superstructure, right? It's a strange attractor, right? It is the playing of a beautiful symphony in a square in Italy, in which everyone begins to resonate with the music because the musical value lives in us. The story is not just a story, it's a story of value. It's a new superstructure, right? Because when there's a crisis of coherence is coherent intimacy. Intimacy comes from a shared story of value. But if there's a crisis of coherence, if there's a meta crisis, it means that I've got to tell a new story of value, which by its very nature is a story of Eros value, and Eros value generates new coherence. But for Yuval, for Skinner, for Orwell, there is no Eros value. It doesn't exist. So the story is not a story of value. And it can't actually generate new coherence because we're attracted and allured to create a new coherence through the story of value. No, story is a cynical, manipulative structure, right, of a dominating infrastructure, social structure that imposes a fictional story in order to create coherence, taking advantage of this weird fluke of evolution that people weirdly cohere around fictional stories. No, not okay. Not okay. And that's a recipe for the death of our humanity. Stories are real. Right? Stories cohere us because God loves stories. And when I say God loves stories, I mean stories are the nature of reality. Reality is not merely bits. Right? Reality is, right, stories. Right? And it's all story all the way up and all the way down. That's what we're going to talk about next week. Okay. Thank you. Whoever made it through, like, thank you. And everyone who dropped off, totally appreciate for all the time you did make it through. And Yuval, if this is a bit harsh, I apologize, but it was sincere. And I'm delighted to debate you at any time, in any forum, public or private, right? Public preferred, right? So we can kind of talk this out in a beautiful way, right? And every word is laced with respect and honor and love and fierce. Krista.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Marc Gafni. Thank each and every one of us for being here, for staying in. This was a 2-hour deep dive, and I know that we can all feel how much this was needed. Like Marc said in the beginning, we need this time to really go deep into this, and we did. And so much appreciating everyone for staying in. And I know that we're way over time. I'm just going to take a couple of minutes, but it feels so important to actually give ourselves also this time to feel into it, to breathe into it, and to feel our gratitude in this moment, because we were gifted such an amazing journey. And Dr. Marc Gafni was the person that was willing and able to speak it for us here today. But there's a deep transmission here today, and I know that we all felt it together. I saw it in the chat box, so much resonance, so much beauty. So just wanting to acknowledge that and to just say thank you. This is us. This is ours to do. Each and every one of us here, we are here for a reason. It's not me holding it. It's not Marc holding it, or Christina or Jamie or Jacqueline or whoever is on the team. It's each and every one of us here. We are called here to be here, to hold this new story, to hold this space for this new story to be born into reality. It's so crazy exciting. And so just let that new story resonate within you throughout the week, and let it activate you from the inside out, and know that you are needed here. Each and every one of us, we are needed here to tell this new story, to embody, to become this new story. So let it activate you, and ask yourself the question, how does this want to be activated in me? What are my unique risks to take? What are my unique, outrageous acts of love to take in this revolution? Because I know that we are here for a reason together. So let's do this together. And one thing that we can and must all do is, one, get this book. And two, go to Amazon to write your review. It's such an easy step that we all can take to bring out this new story that is filled with hope and possibility and goodness and truth and beauty, and make sure that this gets out into the world. So please make a commitment to write your review on Amazon this week if you haven't done that yet. If you have already done that, then it's time for you to take a next step, which is maybe to buy a second book and give it to a friend of yours, to invite a friend to come here and join us next week in One Mountain, Many Paths. Whatever you do, make sure that you participate, because that is so desperately necessary. Thank you so much.